for it. Okay, hello everyone. So it's about using the PowerShell extension for VS Code in the most efficient way. I've been using it for many years. It's matured quite a bit. There have been a few talks, but it's changed a lot as well. So it's a refresher to what is the current state, things that can be done in a bit of a better way, how I would have recommended a couple of years ago. And I'm going to walk through new things, old things, and a mixture of things you can do. There will be some weight on PSScriptAnalyzer in terms of code analysis and formatting, but we'll also talk about other things that are a bit outside of that scope. So the agenda, a bit of an overview, debugging, that's something that has come up on Twitter quite a lot in terms of more advanced scenarios, settings, how to best handle them, tab completion for splatting as a brand new feature, only available in the preview extension, testing, code formatting, and code analysis. So naturally, the last two parts will be script analyzer heavy. Okay, just a very brief intro about me. It's supposed to be a bit more funny, not so serious, about what I've been doing in my career. So I accidentally discovered PowerShell whilst at university just by browsing the available apps. And I just opened it, typed cd, ls, and I thought it's like a Sigwin clone. And I closed it and I moved on with my life. And 5 years later, when I first started my job, I started to really discover what PowerShell is about. So I started as a developer on a tool that was using PowerShell as part of the product. So it was a bit closer to how a normal developer would be to PowerShell. But I already started to like it. I later had to build CI/CD pipelines. And this is where I really started getting more and more into PowerShell, because you could just about do anything and wire things up. The passion started, so I started contributing to PowerShell as it became open source, PSScriptAnalyzer as well. Later became an MVP. And this is at the point where I was still a developer, but very much focus on automation pipelines. Some people would call it already DevOps engineer. And somehow I changed to platform engineering because Azure was coming up and that was crucial. And with infrastructure as code, it wasn't really that different. So this is the time when I really changed from a developer focus to more of a platform infrastructure focus. And it was quite a journey over the last few years, an interesting one. Worked in areas like site reliability engineering, which is quite the opposite field to developer where I started. And I've enjoyed that. I've worked at different sizes companies, from enterprises to startups. Now currently working at Avanade as a DevOps manager. So although I'm a manager, I'm still very technical because that's part of the culture at Avanade. Even at the director level, we expect to still be hands-on and down to earth so that we still know what's going on. If you're interested about joining Avanade, have a chat with me later. We've got lots of roles available. So if you're coming to this talk, then probably you're also interested in those other talks that have been given before, especially the one by Justin Grote last year at PSConf. They all approach it from different angles. My angle is quite different, naturally a bit heavy on code analysis and formatting. But those sessions you will definitely enjoy as well if you want to make your developer experience better, more efficient, find out how to do things better in VS Code. The second one by Tyler Leonard. He used to be a developer on the VS Code PowerShell extension itself. And the bottom one, I think, from the PowerShell org from 2 years ago. So always keep in mind the age. 1 to 2 years is good. Anything older, things have changed quite a bit in the extension. And that's why we're keeping doing those talks to have refreshers. So as a reminder, for people not familiar, there is a PowerShell stable and a PowerShell preview extension that you can have. In the past, we recommended preview quite heavily because it was quite ahead, but there were questions around stability as well. Now they're much more aligned. We've got monthly releases of the stable extension, and the difference between them is becoming smaller and smaller. So now we can really choose between them by thinking about, do we want to use the super latest features, like ones that I will be demoing in this talk, or am I okay with the stable extension just being a month behind, but there will be fewer bugs in there because other users would have reported them earlier, so the decision becomes much easier. It's open source, so you can submit issues, pull requests at your liking. So we'll start with a demo around debugging. All the demos are in this GitHub repo that I've got here in my default experience folder, where I start with the default experience and expand it and make it more sophisticated and show what different toggles we can use. There's also more sophisticated examples here in my pet project being PSScriptAnalyzer that is useful to look at as well. So I'm going to switch over now to my VS Code instance. Which should be coming up now. Okay, so around debugging, it's changed quite a lot, and for good reasons, and it's changed for the better. So now if we've got a standard PowerShell script, I'm just going to make the font a bit bigger. We can just hit F5, and if we have a breakpoint selected, which I can do by clicking on the left, it will run the script, and it will stop right there, which is where we are now. We can inspect variables. We can use the integrated terminal. As some people are familiar with them, it's the one called PowerShell extension here on the right, and could execute commands, print them as well. So that's all fine, and I think some people are familiar with it, but I'm still showing it because some people aren't. So this PowerShell extension shell here is something that comes as part of it, and it's using it for backend services to provide all sorts of information and an analysis on it. But that also means that PowerShell instance is quite busy. Sometimes it might need restarting, and the behavior will be slightly different. A bit how people know that in the past, when you ran a script in the terminal of ISC, could behave slightly differently in some edge cases, and the same thing applies here. So the question was coming up, what if I want to run it in a vanilla PowerShell process? I could be using a Windows terminal, or I could be starting a new PowerShell process here just by clicking the plus button here. I can customize it, so you could have different types of shells. You could use WSL, etc. You could debug this as well. This would go a bit too much in depth for this here, so we're just using standard PowerShell. And it doesn't matter if it's Windows PowerShell or PowerShell Core. The extension handles that behind the scenes for you. So in order to achieve that, though, we need to add some configuration. So if we go to the debug pane on the left, the one that has this bug symbol and the play symbol there, we can create a launch.json file which is showing different configurations. And it already figured out, because I have a PowerShell file open, it showed me different ways how I can debug a PowerShell file. There's ways to attach to .NET processes in other languages, but it's already pre-selected then. So the one that we had by default when we press F5 is launch current file. That works if you don't have parameters. So if you've got parameters, how would you make that work? So interactive session is one that we could use. What happens with this one, if I press play here on it, starts to attach the debugger. And in the shell of the PowerShell extension, I could be running the script now. I could be passing parameters, and it will hit the breakpoint. So this answers the question, how can we do something that is a bit more sophisticated? Parameters, sometimes pester, runs have parameters. You're not running the script directly. You might be running a root script and then calling child scripts. And you get the usual buttons that you might or might not be familiar with, where you can continue until the next breakpoint, you can step over, that means you go to the next line, or you can just detach the debugger and let the script continue, which is useful if you're, for example, in a for each loop and you just want to inspect the first item, maybe look at properties, and then you want the rest to continue. So I still haven't come back to the other use case I was talking about originally. What if I want to run it in a vanilla PowerShell process that might be running somewhere else? It might not be even running in Windows Terminal. It might even be a sub-process of a different program. So we can add another configuration. So if I just type PowerShell, I get the options there. And the options we're going to use is attached to PowerShell host process. So that will allow us, if we select the option here, is attaching to this PowerShell shell here. What we'll need is the process ID though. So to figure that out, we can run $PID, which is an automatic variable that gives us the process ID. So now that we know that, we press play, and it gives us options. So it displays us nicely what is the process ID of the PowerShell extension shell, which is not what we want. We want the second one, 25292, which is matching to the process ID that we've got here. If you've got multiple shells open, quite often it can get confusing. You can label them, which can help you as well, so you don't have to do it via process ID. But it's an easy and foolproof way. So now we're attached to it. But notice it actually switched the shell here. It switched to the PowerShell extension here. So what people sometimes confuse it by, they want to run the script now, but they forgot that the extension switched the shell. So we need to keep going back to our shell. And maybe you want to consider actually not using VS Code here, but maybe using Windows Terminal, because you will find out whenever you operate in this shell of the, you will find the extension is switching between the PowerShell extension, PowerShell process, and the one that we are trying to debug. But it's just once or twice for the purpose of a demo, so I'm not too bothered. So I can now run the script from here. And it should, hit the breakpoint again. So now we've got a debugger attached to a PowerShell script that we can run from any different PowerShell process. We're not bound by the process provided by the extension itself that can have slightly different behavior. Okay, what I recommend, once you've set up your configurations that you would like to use for your project, it creates this launch.json file, and you can actually check that into source control. And you are actually encouraged to do that, because if someone else comes to your project and it's of a certain type, it might be a binary PowerShell module, you'd be using different methods then, like the ones for .NET, for example. And it just means the next time someone comes along, they can already pre-select from types of debugger configurations that are sensible to the project and most commonly used. You can use launch.json for different purposes as well that are not for debugging. So I'll be showing how I use it for PSScriptAnalyzer. If I share the screen here, let's see if I can do that. So for PSScriptAnalyzer, I've got a couple ones. and I use them to build the product or running tests. And the type here is of type PowerShell, and it lets you run an arbitrary script. So this way, I'm helping myself with common things that are ongoing in my build and development and test process, where sometimes I want to build and run tests, or I just want to build and import the module that I've created. It's nice and handy because you can hit the play button and recreate it very quickly. Because sometimes with binary modules, once you've loaded a module and you want to change things, you would have to close the shell and reopen, and that provides a quick way of redoing the same thing. And you see here as well the other .NET methods where we can either attach to full .NET Framework or .NET Core, or directly to any process like I demoed just now. Okay, so the next demo is about settings. I'm going back to VS Code now. So my settings.json file I've checked in as well. And I want to use this opportunity to demo that we don't always have to click around. We can open the files as well using the PowerShell extension. So in IAC, you can type psedit, and now you can do that similarly as well with the PowerShell extension. So if I wanted to open that in the editor, I should open in the wrong terminal. I need to do that in the terminal of the PowerShell extension. Voila, it opens it for me. So you might or might not be familiar with the different levels of settings and how they override. So this setting here is a workspace setting. That's the setting of your project that overrides user settings. And anything that is specific to your project, naturally you want to put there. You want to check that into source control, because it means if someone else opens it, those settings get applied. So that would, for example, apply to formatting settings where you want to have a certain style applied to your project, and that's definitely not a user setting. So you want to override that, and you want to have that defined in your project. Next demo is going to be around testing. So most of you are familiar that if you've got a pester test, it's showing here the run tests option, where it runs just a describe block. I found myself quite often wanting to run the whole file, and then in here running invoke pester, changing the directory, or specifying the file path. So my workflow was I right-clicked on the tab and used copy path, typed in invoke pester, or created an alias if I couldn't type as much, and did this. It's not too bad, but if you do it a lot, it does get repetitive. So what I'm doing now is actually a feature that I added, I think, a year or two ago. So it's naturally always the features that you contribute yourself that you're the most proud of, where now I can click on the tab and I have to make the font a bit smaller so that the menu shows up. And at the bottom, we've got the menu run pester tests, and this allows you to run the whole file. You can also do it in Explorer. You can right click and you get the same options for running or debugging the entire pester test file, or rather than just in an individual describe block. So that I thought is like a nice gem that some people aren't aware of, because it's a bit hidden in the context menu. So now I'm going to talk about PSScriptAnalyzer. So let me switch back to the presentation. So PSScriptAnalyzer is a PowerShell module. It comes as part of the extension, so you don't need to worry about having to install it. It comes out of the box. Docs recently have been migrated to learn.microsoft.com. they used to be in the open source repository. Talking about open source, as usual, any issues you can raise there. You can submit pull requests, although that's sometimes a bit rare. The docs, as they've moved to learn.microsoft.com, they're in the PowerShell docs repository now. A small implementation detail to be aware of: the PowerShell extension doesn't consume PSScriptAnalyzer directly. It uses an intermediary module called PowerShell Editor Services. This is a C# module that allowed them to write it in a more sophisticated way, because the extension is written in TypeScript, and .NET is just a bit more native to PowerShell and allowed it to handle whatever the extension needs to do around managing the PowerShell process. And that sometimes comes into play around how PSScriptAnalyzer is used in the extension. So, for example, a caveat is the defaults are different from ScriptAnalyzer versus what the extension uses. Quite often it's to protect users from not seeing too many warnings and providing a lighter experience, because there's way more users of the PowerShell extension than there are people using PSScriptAnalyzer directly. And there's use cases for different types of users, where some users would just want the convenience, but they might not want everything. But it's good to be aware. If you know ScriptAnalyzer and you want to use them, I will show you how you can maximize the usage in the extension, because you don't get the full experience out of the box. Before we go into this, it will be a series of demos for code analysis and formatting. I'll be doing a demo for splatting, and this is something that only works in the preview extension currently, but should come to the stable one very shortly. So if I'm switching back to VS Code, I'm going to be using the demo file now. So splatting, if people are familiar with, is a way that you can define the parameters in a hash table. And the benefits are visually as well as programmatically. Visually, it means you've got lots of parameters that don't end up going to the right too much or have backticks, which some people dislike, especially because they're hard to see in a hash table as well. The extension will format it for me if I want to. Like here, Control-KF is the shortcut for formatting. So it's nice and easy to read. But it also allows you, if, say, you've got a standard set of parameter values and you call your command multiple times and you want to change that, but you want to avoid repetition, then you can add and remove parameters or override them. And so these are one of the benefits of using splatting. What's been a pain in the last few years is maintaining that code, because you don't get the same tab completion that you get when you've got all in one line, because the editor doesn't know how to marry up the command from the splatted variable, because it's just a splatted variable. But now it does. There used to be a community module that did that, but it broke repeatedly over the last few years. And in my opinion, that was one of the main missing points for splatting. I actually did a pull request against PowerShell itself at a time when an RFC was open for adding a new syntax to allow inline splatting to happen without an intermediary or temporary variable. That didn't proceed for various design reasons. And now at least this still allows me what otherwise this other feature would have allowed me, which is having tab completion. So I'm pressing Control Space and it's showing me all the parameters. So it's now very easy to add a parameter to splatted commands. Okay, moving on to formatting. There's lots of settings. So if I go just here and start type PowerShell.code formatting, They don't even display in one list. I have to scroll. There's that many. And that's because it's very finely grained and you can pick and choose what you want. If you're not sure and you just want to have a start, choose the preset setting. And there's a variety of ones. So if I choose, my common one is this stroop. And if I hover over, it shows me what this means, because I quite often don't remember the names, and it gives you a link that shows you the different styles. The styles are the difference mainly around where the braces are. If the brace starts on the same line or a new line, or if the else is cuddled or not. That's kind of the long and short between them. And it's a meta setting that implicitly allows you to control all those smaller settings, whether you want the new line after close brace or after open brace, all of that. You can still override individual ones and you could create your custom one, but it's an easy way to get started. So you can have your code consistently formatted. As I said, quite often the choice is just, do you want the brace to be in the same line or the next line? The next line is quite often a bit more C# inspired from people with a .NET background, people more from a Linux background or previous C languages prefer it on the same line. But it's just a style question, so you can pick and choose what you want. A setting that I added a couple years ago was around pipeline indentation style. It's been in the works for quite a while. Had to go through a couple of bug fix iterations. I think there's still a couple of edge cases, but I think we've got good functionality working now. What it allows you is to, if you've got multiple pipes, indent your pipes. So the default is to indent just the first line. You can indent every line or not indent at all. The default, as we see here, is indenting one line. If you find there's some edge cases, because you can write very generic PowerShell code and it's very difficult to cater for all the cases, and trying to write generic code that knows how code is structured, where you can have braces and things like that everywhere, then I would suggest using the no indentation option of this pipeline indentation style. If you're hit by one of those edge cases or you just don't want any indentation to happen. In the last few years, I've been adding a couple more settings in PSScriptAnalyzer that are exposed in the extension as well via whitespace, inside brace, around pipe, and between parameters. And essentially for format here, as the name say, first of all, it ensures I've got one space around the pipe. White space between parameters tidies me up the extraneous white space that I've got here, which quite often happens as we type and edit, you end up with multiple ones. And what else was there? Around the brace as well. So making sure on the inside we've got one space each. So you can control them individually, whether you want them or not. And the nice thing is it does it as part of formatting. And it's quite often you write your code, you run the formatter, it does a nice tidy up. You don't have to do it manually anymore. Those settings are not enabled by default, though. That's maybe what I want to highlight. Especially the next one that is quite handy for correct casing, where we might be typing out things quickly. And sometimes people type out the command in the shell, because when you press tab completion, it gives you the correct casing. Not so much in the editor. But again, we can use formatting, and with the setting, it can correct it to the right casing. Quite nice. We can do the same thing for aliases as well. And you write your code once, you do one final format. You can also use the format command. So Control-Shift-P allows you to run a command of VS Code. And if you type PowerShell, you see all the commands from PowerShell. If you just type format, it uses the formatter of the given language, so it automatically knows to use the PowerShell extension. And then it would format me the entire document, so I don't have to select all to format. which is nice as well. And I suggest you as well to explore what other commands are available there. Okay, just checking on comments. We're good on that. Okay. Quickly going to switch to the presentation and want to ask people as well if there's any questions before we proceed to code analysis. Question coming in: for custom rules, how quickly do you expect them to run? Custom rules always take a bit of time because they do run PowerShell and they're not written in C#. The default rules of PSScriptAnalyzer are written in C#. That's why they're much faster. So it all depends how big your script is and what you do in your custom rule. As a rule of thumb, it's like an additional second for one run. Just wondering if you use any personal PowerShell profile. I'm not sure what you mean by profile. Do you mean the dollar profile? And it's worthwhile mentioning there's a separate dollar profile for the extension. It can be different to the. Oh yeah. You mean that? So the dollar profile path is slightly different for the extension compared to the one of a standard shell. What I'm sometimes doing is I've got it defined once and I'm just dot sourcing my common profile to share it. So this way I've got the same profile in the extension process.
You're not sharing your screen anymore, as far as I can see.
Sorry. Yeah, let me go back. Thank you. So let me briefly show on the PowerShell extension process. I've typed profile. So we see here the path is going to path similar to app data. Not really, but you see from the name here, it's a different file. So what I'm doing is I'm just in there, just dot sourcing the path of my regular PowerShell profile. I've got slightly different approaches for my work machine versus my personal machine. Sometimes the difference is PushGit, which can increase the startup time, which I want to avoid in the extension because I'm not using it really because you get Git tooling as part of VS Code. But yeah, I do use it and mainly I dot source it, but without PushGit. Okay. So briefly going back to formatting and just a quick question, Gail, how much time have I got? Do I have till 6, 6:15 or 6:30?
Let's just say 5 to 6. 5 to 6 for you. Sorry,
Okay.
time's up. Another 10 minutes.
Yeah. Okay, that should fit nicely. So to wrap up formatting, which the presentation should be coming through, the non-default settings that I recommend that will make your life better, and some of them I've demoed, is autocorrect aliases, use constant strings. So what this one does is convert double-quoted strings to single-quoted strings where you don't need the interpolation, which is what the double quotes are for. Makes it easier to view, and also if you use any special characters, then you don't end up accidentally interpolating them. Use correct casing of them or the white space between parameters because it's a nice tidy up, and pipeline indentation space, that one I've demoed. And this is usually what I do on a new machine. I turn those settings on. Yeah, it gives me a better experience compared to the default. Code analysis. So like I mentioned, not all the rules are on by default. You can actually look at the code there where it's defined which rules are run by the extension. I think it's around 10 or so, and they've been debated, but it also means if you want to add some you can open a pull request and have the discussion whether you think it's worthwhile adding it to the default experience. So now I'm going to show you how you can achieve that. So I'm going to switch back to VS Code. So if I'm looking at some analysis here, I see some squiggles there, it's fine. I don't see squiggles here, although there is a script analyzer warning or rule that should flag. So how can I enable this? So in the past, I used to recommend to set the settings path and use your PSScriptAnalyzer settings file. There's a default name called PSScriptAnalyzer settings.psd1 that when you run that with invoke script analyzer, it picks it up without specifying it explicitly. In extension now does the same, where I don't have to specify the path anymore. So what I can do is, behind the scenes, I'm restoring such a file, which has popped up now. And as a start, I can just have it an empty hash table. That's the format of it. Save. I can change it and the extension will update, but whether I add or remove it and it's using a settings file or not, the extension wouldn't really notice. So there's no change there. So in this case, this is the first time I can use it, I have to restart the PowerShell extension process, which I can use the restart session command for. So it's restarting now. And sometimes I find for the first time, you can give it time, but you can prod it to do analysis by just typing a space or something. And it comes up quicker. Now we see it's showing the script analyzer warning. So what we've done, we've told it now, run all the script analyzer rules that are available. That is equivalent to running invoke-script analyzer. So now you get much more. Maybe you're getting a bit too much. So we can look at customizing that. Have a look at the docs, but essentially the parameters you've got on the commandlet of invoke script analyzer, they're duplicated in a settings file. So the -exclude rules parameter, you can have it as a top level here. So we could be saying, let's exclude the declared variables more than assignments, which we've got highlighted here. So let me actually see if I can just copy paste that and it just works. Sometimes error handling is not the best. So we've added that in there and we see it's gone away. So now we can slowly remove rules if it's too much. And we can also customize them more. So if I look at my other template, I could be looking at the avoid using commandless aliases, and I could say, well, I'm actually okay using cd because it's such a common command that no one would override it. I'm okay not seeing that. So in order to not have the squiggly here, I put it into my settings file, I save it, and it should soon update. See, there we go. And then, as it's a PowerShell structure, you can add more items. So you could add your other PS rule and whatever you want. You can still, if you want to have different settings file for different purposes, you could still have multiple ones in there. I recommend just having one with this name because the extension picks it up automatically so that you don't have to specify the path anymore in the settings. These settings can be useful if, for example, you don't specify it in your repository and you have a file somewhere that you want to use across everything, and that might be a local path or something on a file share. Of course, the implication is it wouldn't work on someone else's machine, but some people, I've seen them want to do that scenario as well, and that's why the setting still exists, to point it to an arbitrary path. Okay, looking at the time, I'm very close to 5:2, so I don't want to add more things, but rather be open for questions. Well, thanks, Jimmy. And thanks as well for spending your time listening. I hope it was useful to you. Yes, I will be sharing the slides. Do you have maybe a page where I could upload it to, Gail, or shall I just put it on my GitHub? Either way, I will make sure it is there. I'm going to definitely drop it into this repo, so I'm going to drop the link there so that you can take a note. I will upload it here, so here is where you will definitely find it. Entering PID might be a lifesaver. Yes, that's quite nice. As I said, you can also label your PowerShell process, and then it will be easy for you to find. There are built-in variables in PowerShell. I don't remember the name on top of my head, what they are, but when you see the drop-down, you remember one of them said PowerShell extension. You can label them, give them a human-readable name. So this might be easier than having to use PID, because in your script, you could run it so it automatically sets the name of your PowerShell process. That could be useful to you as well. Have a look at automatic variables in PowerShell. I think there's one of them where you can set the name. Okay, if there's no questions, I would otherwise wrap up. And yeah, again, thanks for coming. So I'm a bit late because I saw the time being 5:30 on the Meetup page. So maybe I got a bit confused there. But yeah, thanks for staying.